He's actually the author of multiple works on this topic, including a book that I have read titled Preparing to Study Abroad and Learning to Cross Cultures. It is available on Amazon, and no, Dr. Duke did not tell me to say that, but it's a fantastic resource for everyone. And without further ado, we would love to learn more from you, Dr. Duke, and discover more through your presentation, Below the Iceberg. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia. It's wonderful to be with you all today, and great to see many of you on screen a few minutes ago. So I have worked in the field of study abroad and international education for quite some time, for more than 20 years, and really enjoy talking about cultural learning and international travel, all of the wonderful things that come through that. Today, I'm going to be focusing on intercultural learning that's here, and less about when we take students to another country, and much more about as you're in your classrooms, working with students or whatever your role with students, how can we apply some of these elements of intercultural learning into that teaching? So we'll talk just briefly about some concepts for culture. We'll discuss this concept of below the waterline or below the iceberg, and how that helps us to see and perceive cultural differences more actively in the work that we do. So Stephanie and Alicia had asked if we could do some element of discussion along the way. So here's an option for discussion, if you will, if you'd like to put into the chat. What do you mean by culture? If you hear this word culture, how would you define that? So take a minute or so, and on a piece of paper, on your computer, in your mind, whatever, describe for yourself, what do you mean by culture? And then as well, identify 2 or more metaphors that could help your students to understand what culture includes. So I'll just pause there and see what kind of comments come through the chat here. Okay, here's a colleague describing culture, a collection of beliefs and behaviors shared by a community or society. Beliefs and practices of a subset of people. I think those are great, both great definitions. Any ideas of some metaphors, some concepts that can help students to think of culture and how it's practiced or experienced? Give you a few more seconds to think of that. As you think of that, I'm going to move on and go to this next slide. Here's another definition, how things get done around here. Right, those beliefs and practices, what people do, how things get done, the unspoken rules as well as the spoken rules. Combination of a combination of values, expectations, beliefs, plus the inherent assumptions about how people should behave or should act. Something that gets passed along to other people. I think that was embedded in one of those. Let me come back here. Yeah, so the first one that was shared in the chat, beliefs and behaviors shared by a community or society. So sharing that information, beliefs and practices of a subset of people. The products also used and created by a group of people influenced by history, location, and tradition. I really like that. Because these concepts, these attitudes, these expectations get shared both implicitly and explicitly. Here's someone else. Culture is like when you visit grandma's house, the rules are different. And maybe she speaks to you in another language. I like that, especially as many of us may be foreign language educators. So there's a lot of these cultural things that do get passed along. And I would say in both English and in whatever language, Spanish, French, German, Russian, clearly, and any, well, not just any, there are multiple levels of expectations that get passed along. A very clear thing that I need to say, and I think all of you in the Zoom room will agree, but just to say it out loud, every person has a culture. And it's interesting, as I've worked with American Study Abroad students, preparing that is college students preparing to go abroad and then coming back, how many Americans think that they don't have culture, right? If I'm going to Mexico or going to Spain, that they have culture over there, but I don't have culture, right? I don't have that element of what I'm thinking of. So one thing that you could do to normalize this idea of culture and cultural learning is just to recognize that every student in your room has a culture, right? They have a set of things get done, habits, values, expectations, beliefs, all of the things that have been said in the chat. Another clear thing is that there's nothing like a national culture. It's common that we, someone is preparing, well, talking about Spanish and thinking about Mexico versus Spain, and then sort of labeling that this is Spanish culture and this is Mexican culture. The reality is that these are subsets of people. There are probably, in my guesstimation, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of cultural groups in the United States today, right? A population of 330 plus million people in the US. It's obvious that there are more than one cultural group here, right? So this could be age, it could be location of the country, it could be what languages people grew up with. I mean, all different ways in which people have a variety of cultural backgrounds. So all of us have more than one related to the people that we interact with, the groups that we belong to, the families that we grew up with. This is well beyond the color of our skin, but it does include the color of our skin. African American students, Hispanic American students, Arab American students, all are going to have various sort of groupings, cultural heritage from the groups that they came from, and then others that they develop or recognize as they go to public school, for example. So although it's easy to talk about national culture, right? In China or Chinese culture, it's this way. I recommend trying to think more broadly than that, because national culture is really not reality. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper. A lot of research has been done on culture and intercultural learning and intercultural competency, intercultural communication, cross-cultural psychology. I mean, the number of fields just goes on and on. But what I'm going to talk about is some well accepted sort of core principles. And one is that culture includes knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And our colleague Janet Bennett has framed this as head, heart, and hands. These are great concepts that you could use with your kids, whether they're first graders, whether they're ninth graders or 12th graders, right? Thinking of language and intercultural learning as a combination of knowledge, skills, and attitudes, with head, heart, and hands as kind of that way to make this practical. It's a combination of how people behave and interact. They need to consciously know things, but they also need to check their own assumptions and expectations, and then kind of be aware that the interlocutors, right, the people they're interacting with, might have different assumptions and expectations. So language is a part of this, but we can have, I mean, there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who speak various versions of English. There's a UNK faculty member who's been teaching a UNK course, the University of Nebraska Kearney, on multiple Englishes, right? Global Englishes in the plural sense, to recognize that there's lots of varieties of English, and there's a lot of different cultural habits, patterns, and expectations that people have even in English. So no surprise that with Spanish, with Russian, with Chinese, with French, right, there's going to be lots of regional and international elements of this. And relationships and interactions are part of that. Okay, I didn't, let's see, I don't think I came back to the metaphors. So we were talking about metaphors. One metaphor that we'll talk about in a minute is that of the iceberg. The idea that there's some part of the iceberg that's above, that's visible, and some things that are lower. And that's a common metaphor that's widely used in teaching about intercultural learning and cultural competency. Another one is the concept of the fish in the fishbowl. So think of a goldfish, and sorry, I don't have an image for this, but think of a fish. We'll just say a goldfish, but could be any color or variety of fish that is sitting in your fish tank, in your fishbowl, whatever, however large or small that might be. That fish is surrounded by culture. As that fish goes on and on around the fish tank, right? The fish is completely immersed in culture. So think of that water as the culture. The fish is largely oblivious to that. It's the environment in which the fish is swimming. And yet the fish is largely just, this is the way things are done, right? The fish is unaware that humans might interact with air in a different way than fish do, right? There's all of these things that fish by itself is oblivious to other ways of doing things. And yet that cultural, right, domain surrounds the fish. It gives it life, it gives it breath, gives it, provides food, I suppose. But everything that fish experiences is sort of taken for granted. And I would say that that's true for almost everybody in the world, right? We take for granted what we know and experience, and we assume that everybody else is living that same way. And yet, as we kind of think through this, there are a lot of ways in which things get done differently by different groups of people, right? Including in our own neighborhoods and in our own schools. Another concept or metaphor here is that of the onion. This is a concept that the Peace Corps has used for a good 50, 60 years to think about culture. So think of that onion as being large, but with layers. And as one pulls back the layers, they discover more things. And at least how the Peace Corps often describes it, sort of the core, what's at the center of that onion are values. Sort of the core values that motivate someone: love, acceptance, right? The ability to live life to its fullest. Those are sort of the values. The expectations and behaviors are kind of what gets us to those values. But we need to peel those back sort of one at a time to be able to learn what's in the middle of that onion. So there may be many other metaphors that you might have thought of. If so, feel free to put them in the chat. Another one that I've heard of that I really like is that of a tree. So you've got the visible part of the tree above the ground, right? So you've got right branches, you got leaves. Some trees might have fruit, some trees might have flowering before the fruit, right? So there's a lot of things that you can see there. But what is equally important is what's below the tree line, right? Below the ground. What is affecting the health and the vitality of that tree are the things that are happening below the ground that are hard to see to the untrained eye. So again, things to think of. So just a very quick definition of intercultural competence. There are hundreds. So this is just a definition that I like. A lot of good people have written about intercultural competence, but I like this one. Intercultural competence is the ability to communicate and act appropriately and effectively across cultural difference. So both communication and action are needed. Understanding what is appropriate is a key part of this. Certainly it's possible to communicate inappropriately. People do this all the time, right? Daily. But also to be effective. We need to be able to express, even in a intermediate language class, to be able to get our point across, right? It does not require full linguistic ability, but it does require that we have some sort of mental state, right, of head, heart, and hands, to be able to figure out what is needed in this communication act, to be able to get my point across and for me to feel like I've done as appropriately as possible, that interaction. So if that is our definition of intercultural competence, what we're trying to do is help our students to develop that full set of skills. The way that we get there is through intercultural learning. So intercultural learning, this is my definition, the process of learning across cultural differences. It includes affective, behavioral, and cognitive elements of learning through experience. So affect is this element of emotion and how we feel about it. Behavioral, cognitive, right? This is the head, heart, and hands. So it's the process of learning. And what's critical here is that intercultural learning involves experience, right? This is experiential learning. We learn things like riding a bicycle by doing, not by just sitting in the classroom and saying, okay, when people are in Mexico, this is the way they act. Okay, that's nice. That's a cognitive element. The affective and the behavioral comes when you're in the room, talking with someone from Mexico, having multiple interactions, and learning through experience. So in the study abroad world, over the last 15 years, I've been advocating for faculty, as you go abroad with students, make sure that they're interacting with local people. That seems pretty obvious. It's a reality that, you know, tens of thousands of American faculty will go abroad this year with students, and many of them will not plan intentionally for students to have interaction with local people. Kind of seems odd, but that's the way many American faculty, right, function. They just, we're going to go and we're going to have this class and we're going to do our thing there, but they are often having what my colleague Mick Vandenberg says, an American experience in Berlin, an American experience in Paris, an American experience in, you know, South Africa somewhere. So what we need to do, and this is, again, my advocacy to you as language educators, is to plan for interactions so your students have opportunities to learn through experience. So here we come to this iceberg metaphor, and we'll talk about a few examples here over the next 10 or 20 minutes. But this is the core of the iceberg metaphor, right? This element or this idea that there's visible parts and less visible. So as Alicia mentioned, I published a book in 2014 called Preparing to Study Abroad, Learning to Cross Cultures. I think it's a great introduction for anyone in, you know, K-12 as well as college students, that idea of we're preparing to go abroad. And I used this graphic, and I used it with permission from Language and Culture Worldwide LLC, because I really liked the way they had done this graphic. So let's just walk through the graphic. You can see here at the top, behaviors and practices. This kind of correlates to what we would call observable, right? The area of the behavior or interactions that is observable, characteristics that might be apparent to the casual observer. And then the majority, at least in the concept of the iceberg, the majority of things are not observable. This would include things like religion, religious traditions, history, historical interpretations, media, how people consume media, what types of media they develop, economic systems, families, family dynamics, family systems, educational systems, the way school is structured, right? All of those. And within this area, then, interpretations and core values. So interpretations, how core values are reflected in everyday life, such as working and socializing. And then core values, what is considered good or bad, desirable or undesirable, acceptable or unacceptable. And many of us have experience. You probably do this in your classroom on a day-to-day basis, right? What is acceptable, what's not acceptable? If your kids are yelling and screaming at you, you're saying, no, that's not acceptable to do in this environment, right? We're in a classroom, use your indoor voices. You're reinforcing a set of cultural values as you do that. So those interpretations of what is good or bad, what is appropriate, inappropriate, that's happening in your classrooms and your schools, not just your classroom, but throughout the school on a day-to-day basis. So where do we go with this metaphor then? Let me introduce a couple of other concepts, and then we'll get to what this might look like. As we talk about some dimensions of culture, I need to just say that it's easy for us to think of culture in yes, no, sort of far right, far left extremes. And the reality is that for most things, they're on a spectrum, right? As we think of cultural practices and habits and values, we could put them on a spectrum rather than it's all or this or it's all of that. So I wanted to help us to think of dimensions, spectra of behavior as we think about some of these cultural expressions, because some children are going to be more like their parents in this way, and other children might be a little bit different. Some might be a little bit different, and that's okay. That's just how human behavior works. So think of this as a spectrum, and that many things in life, cultural patterns follow this, generally follow a bell curve. So as we think about some of these things like individualism and collectivism, it's often common to see sort of a bell curve with that. That is, within a population of 100 or 1,000 people that you're talking about, the majority are going to sort of fall towards the middle and be kind of normal in that area, but they're going to be outliers, right? This is just to be expected. If we're talking about individualism, you're going to find a bunch of people who sort of practice and live that individualist kind of experience. You're going to have some people who are outliers on both sides. That's, again, very typical in human society, that not everybody is going to follow the pattern, right? As you think of your own children or your own kids in school, if you've got 4 classrooms of 40 kids each, and most of them behave a certain way, there are going to be a few who act this way and a few who act that way. That's kind of typifying the bell curve. But we can talk about generalizations. So in general, and by generalizations, it's going to kind of follow that normal bell curve, the element in the middle. We can see that in Mexico, or in this location in Mexico, many people do this, recognizing that many people might not do that, even if they have the same cultural values. Okay, so now let's think about what is above the waterline, what might be some elements of below the waterline that language teachers and K-12 teachers can attend to as they think about, how will I help my students to learn more about this? What I call elements that are above the waterline are visible elements of culture, things like food, clothing, art, music, infrastructure and technology, how people shop, how do you get your food, how do you bring the food in. These are very common things that are generally easy to see. And, food and clothing, we can say, okay, in this location of the world, these are the common things that you could see on the dinner table. These are the kinds of foods that are desirable in that society. These are the patterns that we can see in clothing, how people dress, what type of music they enjoy. What we're really here for is to talk about what's below the waterline. And I'm going to put this in air quotes as less visible, because I would argue that most of these elements are actually visible, but most of the time we're not looking for them. So when we're attending to a conversation and we're thinking about our own position, we're not thinking of how this other person that we're interacting with is actually acting. Many of these, we can see this actually once you're trained for it, in how they express themselves, the body language, a lot of things that you could say, oh, well, now that I'm looking for that, I can see this on a regular basis. So this is the summary. We're going to get into some of this in a little bit more detail, but communication styles. Verbal and nonverbal communication is a very common element of intercultural communication and cultural patterns. So let's think about communication styles. If you're teaching students about communication, I would advocate that communication styles could and should be a part of that instruction. Conflict styles. There are different ways that people show conflict around the world. We can see that there are some patterns, again, on this side of the spectrum and that side of the spectrum. A lot of people will be in the middle. All kinds of elements of relationships, including individualism and collectivism. Approaches to the use of time. Many of you have seen this in your own lives. People who have the cultural attitude that I have all kinds of time, and if I'm late, that's okay. And others who are down to the minute. Okay, if you're not 5 minutes early, you're late. That kind of thing. And of course, gender roles and expectations. So let's get into a few elements. Again, I'm not going to have time to cover everything, but happy to take questions or comments as we get to the end of the discussion. How do you see this in your own classroom, your own lived experience? So thinking of direct communication as a less visible aspect of culture, right? There are lots of ways in which American people live and act direct communication. We do this inherently. I should say many of us, because not everyone in the US, not every citizen does it the same way, but very commonly in the US, we are very direct communicators. Direct communicators generally have the information is contained in the text or the words. If we're going to give a set of directions, the set of directions is contained in the words, whether we read it or write it. Right, we can see what that instruction is. It's common in America to say what you mean, right? If you want to say something, this is how you're supposed to behave. This is what I want in that paper that you're supposed to turn in next Monday. Say what you mean, right? Make it clear. Knowledge of or relationships with the people involved is generally less important, right? In direct communication systems, we don't really need to know who that child or that family is. We just give them the detail. The expectation is that directly stating a position is necessary and helpful, right? That's generally kind of the landscape of direct communication. Now, as many of you know from your own work with your own students, maybe your own time abroad or living in different parts of the country or parts of the world, right? There are a lot of people who feel very comfortable with indirect communication. So again, this is a less visible aspect of culture. Once you begin to see it, it's right easier to see. But indirect communication is common in most parts of the world. So if you have kids with families coming from many parts of the Middle East and Africa, from East Asia, there are many parts of the world where it's very common, comfortable for families to show up with this indirect communication system. Japan is often regarded, at least 20 or 30 years ago, as kind of the other extreme. If America is on one side of the extreme, Japan is more on that other. But I would say many other Asian and African cultures, Middle Eastern cultures might be like this. So indirect communication is where you don't say what you mean, where it's important to do nonverbal elements of communication, hinting at concerns, stating the obvious, checking the surroundings, right? The ambience of the room, or what the flowers look like, how well the table is set. All kinds of ways in which people in, let's say, Japan, communicate about something that is not even stated. People who are indirect communicators can often say no without using the word no. So it's common for Americans going to Japan to talk about a certain situation, to talk about whether this person, right, invite someone to a gathering, and for the person to say something like, I'll need to check my schedule, or that's interesting. And for the American, who's the direct communicator, to not hear the word no, but that person clearly communicated no in their own cultural right expectation. And for Americans who are listening for no, yes, right, we want this clear, it's either one way or the other, just say it how it is. Indirect communicators generally don't say it how it is because they're concerned about things like power dynamics, about not giving offense, about shame. They're trying to avoid shame for themselves, their own family, their whole group, or not bringing shame on you because you should have known that answer. What's clear in indirect communication is that relationships are vital, right? It is vital to understand the relationships. If a child knows that his or her parents communicate in a certain way, right, there's a pecking order, and that child with parents will recognize the dynamics without things being said. If one is a parent but knows that there are other parents who have other ideas, right, the parents can sort of look around the room and very clearly communicate without ever saying a word. There's all kinds of examples of this, from the way in which flowers get presented, the way in which people dress, whether it's appropriate for the situation or not, right? There's a lot of communication going on, but we direct communicators might miss it because we're missing some of those relational elements of how people communicate. So just attend to this, recognize that many of your parents and many of your students, certainly coming from the Middle East or from parts of Asia, might be very sensitive about saying things directly to you as the powerful teacher who is in charge of their life. They might not want to tell you what's going on, or why they couldn't do their homework, why they couldn't get the project done, right? Because they're concerned. So power is an element of this. Here's another combination, again, still in the less visible aspects of culture. One is individualism. And again, as we think of kind of the extremes, we'll call one end individualism, the other collectivism. The reality is that there are a lot of people somewhere in the middle. It's not like this is an either or. It's some sort of combination for a lot of us. But America is often considered strongly on the individualist side, and other places strongly on the collectivist side. So one element of being an individualist is the focus on the individual, right? The individual as the central focus of decision-making and responsibility, right? So this is common in the US. If we're telling our children, you know, you really need to do your homework, you better show up on Monday or Friday with your project done, take responsibility, right? We're emphasizing this individual as the central locus of control and decision-making, and that can be common, but in other parts of the world, it is not. So collectivism is sort of that other polar opposite, I could say, right? It's the other side of the spectrum. Here, the focus is on the group, the needs of the group, the family, the clan, you could say, the economic resources, and the goodwill, the health and well-being of the members within the group. Within collectivist cultures, honor plays a really strong role. So it's important for all the members of that family or group to recognize that they need to be honorable. They need to honor those who are of senior status to them, right? Respect for elders, for parents, for those with authority. In some cultures, this is men, right? So this can be, seen as paternalistic. But there's other cultures where the women play as much or more of a role than the men, but still those who of senior status can be the more dominant ones. And so showing honor, respect to those with more status is really essential for, children and youth. So people in a collectivist culture might behave more around how does the group feel about something? How will we use our time? How will I use my time to help the group? That could be an 8-year-old child going out to work, right, in the afternoon or evening because the family is struggling, and the group needs are much more important than the individual needs. This could be the 9th grader who is uncertain about what to answer in a quiz or a verbal sort of conversation because he or she doesn't know what the right answer is for the group. right? Sort of attending to the needs of the group and the group dynamics much more than what they individually feel. We could go on and on about both of these, individualism and collectivism. We need to add approaches to time because there's a lot of research on different ways in which time is experienced differently in different parts of the world. In the US, we have a very time-focused culture. Time is money, right, is a common one, common phrase in the US, where we reinforce that we need to be using time, right, all through the day. We need to be carefully using our time. And this goes well beyond just saying time is important, to say we focus on schedules, we focus on timeliness, we are less flexible when meetings are late or run over, right? There's all of these elements. On the other side is a position, shall we say, around the world where time is fluid, where it's circular, where time is much more important for relationships. If I go down the street and I see my best friend from middle school and I take a half hour to hang out with that person and catch up, that is time well spent. Well, I might be late for work, but actually the relationship is much more important than getting home on time or something else. So again, children who are coming to this country from these other parts of the world might feel very different about time than you or I might. So that's one element. But even those within our own society, right? US American citizens can feel very differently about time depending on the families in which they were raised. I need to add in conflict styles because these are important. So on one extreme is the idea of calm down, don't show emotion, tell directly what the issue is, deal with the issue after anger has subsided, right? It's this cultural conflict style, which is to reduce the amount of overt emotional conflict. On the other side is the idea that emotions are natural. Raising your voice is actually healthy. Dealing with the problem in the moment when you're angry is appropriate, right? So we can see, again, two kind of sides, and a lot of us might be in the middle, depending on the day and depending on what the element is. I was in a training, this is about 15 years ago, with a very large Black African-American. He was doing this, he had been doing corporate training for a good 30 years. He was at the university I used to work at in North Carolina, and basically said, you know, I've grown up in the African-American community. If I'm angry, I'm going to say it. And when a Black man gets really angry, the voice goes up, right? The temperature goes up. The visible emotion is visible, right? You can see it once you see it. But this is an element of an internal conflict style that is very common among African-American people. So, you know, if you've got a young Black boy in your class and he doesn't get something right on his assignment, or he doesn't get the right answer, he might be visibly angry. He might be showing you an intercultural conflict style where showing emotion is not just acceptable, but it's right by definition, this is the way you should do it. This is the way to be healthy. I'll mention just a few of these in passing. Power distance. In America, we generally have a flat power distance, less hierarchy between low people in society and the CEO or the president, right? You can call your principal by first name. You can call your professor by the first name. All of that shows a flatter power distance. In other places, and I'll pick on Germany here, that hierarchy is much bigger, right? Between people who are of lower status, those who have degrees and credentials. There's a lot bigger power distance there that shows up very clearly in the work exposure. I'll mention the research of a fellow, Geert Hofstede or Hofstede, worked in the 1970s, published a lot of this research. Culture's Consequences is a great book. It's very dense and thick. So if you're not a social science researcher, you know, this is probably not the easy one to read, but you know, it's got a lot of detail. Here are 5 categories or cultural patterns that Hofstede identified through his research with tens of thousands of participants. I've talked about some of them, right? Individualism and collectivism as kind of the extremes or the far sides, again, with many people in the middle. Power distance is another one. Another that he talks about is uncertainty avoidance. This idea that people might avoid uncertainty. They want, that is on one extreme in America, we're okay not knowing the answer. And you're going to know from your own experience, a lot of people are just going to BS their way through, I don't know, but I'll just make up an answer because I don't know. On the other side of those people who are really sensitive, if I don't know, that shows a problem with me, not with the circumstances. So uncertainty avoidance, long-term and short-term orientations to time. There are other people who've done research as well. Hamden Turner and Trompenaars, great book. This is Riding the Waves of Culture. This is focused on global business, but I think there's a lot of relevance to K-12 education. So you can see some of this. And then, so I'll just finish there. I've got just an example or two of how you could do this in your own experience. There's a great book called Building Cultural Competence, a collection of activities. It's 45 or 50 activities. Darla Deerdorf, her name is here at the bottom, is one of the editors and collectors of these activities. There are a bunch of others that are also written and published with the idea to use and adapt them. Darla's example is a really good one, and it's something that you can very comfortably do in any classroom in 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 25 minutes. So it's a really quick and easy way to illustrate that not just in these areas of culture, but in individual preferences, we can see how people quickly form a spectrum, or what she calls a human values continuum. So this is just one example, right? You can get your kids up, you can do this with teachers, you can do this with parents. And say, okay, we're gonna, well, you wanna talk about the idea of a continuum or a spectrum. Okay, go to the far left side of the room if you always want to make important decisions by yourself. And go to the far right side of the room if you always consult with family and friends about what's important, right? Those important decisions, and it's okay to be somewhere in the middle. I've done this as recently as mid-April with a group of about 20 faculty. Done this many times with students and faculty as well. And it's very quickly apparent that you've got a whole wide range of opinions, right? Some of this is personal preference, some of it may be cultural patterns that they have internalized. A quick and easy way that you can do with your kids about any number of topics. One of which is competition, right? Go to the far side if you think the competition is best. To the far left, I'm sorry, far other side of the room, if cooperation is the way to get things done, or somewhere in the middle if you think that it's a combination, right? You're going to, with most groups, you're going to see a lot of people in the middle. I would say in my experience, more people are on the cooperation side than on the competition side. But, you know, this is about 8 years ago, I did a workshop. One lady went to the far side on the competition. She said that she was a dance professor, that her experience growing up and through her adult life was competition is what she did, right? She had to compete, she had to perform, she had this sort of drive of competition that was really essential to her and her professional experience, right? So comfortably, she's over here on the right on competition. Change, tradition, you could do Coke versus Pepsi. I mean, there's any number of topics you could do. Is it better to eat your breakfast before you use the bathroom or after you use the bathroom? Who knows? Pick any language concept, right? I can think of mine from Russian, but think of your language, Spanish, French, Russian, German, Chinese. Figure out a way in which you can sort of help students to see on a day-to-day basis that not everybody is in one corner, shall we say, on any one issue. Here's some other examples. I use this as an intro to workshops that I do, anywhere from 20 to 40 people. Who follows college football? Who follows college basketball? I've done this at universities where college football is king, right? It's big, and maybe 5–10% of the people follow college football, right? I mean, they're not paying attention to the things that we think. Now, I'm not going to ask about the Huskers, but college basketball, college volleyball, women's volleyball, right? Nebraska UNL has had what, 3 or 4 national championships in the last 5 or 6 years. Many people never hear about it, but you can do this about Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, cooking, any others. Anyway, I've gotten to the end here. So what questions do you have, or Alicia or Stephanie, what comments do you want to highlight at this stage?
Thank you so much, Dr. Duke. We have a couple questions, most of them submitted to the host here, but I'm gonna feature Danielle's question first. And she said, how do we as teachers shorten the power distance for students of different cultures if they need help in terms of academic help or perhaps another issue?
Okay, so just some quick ideas, because you're just asking about quick ideas. There is this research on power distance, and the idea of power distance is that those at the low side feel this great difference between those at their area and those of higher power, whether that's principals or teachers, all of that. One thing that could be done to help students to feel a little bit that there's more egalitarianism, right, more level playing field, is just to invite their conversations and invite their questions, to show that you are vulnerable, to show that you don't have all the answers. One of the things that I often do when I'm talking with American faculty who are taking students abroad, right? We're taking American students, most of whom don't have a good facility in a foreign language, so they're kind of functioning in English, is just to have them ask lots of people the same question. And then as their students come back to them and give them a report about that experience, for this American professor not to feel like they are the expert. So the idea is that if I feel that I have to be the expert, if I have to tell every student the right answer for every question that they ask, that puts me in the driver's seat in a position of power, but I often don't know what I'm doing, right? I often don't know those answers. So this idea of learning through experience is to turn that around, right? To help the student to see that he or she can be the one to make the observations, to learn through experience, and to be, right, to feel comfortable saying something like, I don't know, what have you observed? I don't know the answer. Who do you think you might ask who might have a better answer than I do? Who in your network might have experienced that before? Who might you ask, right? Another student who's already figured that out, right? So rather than feeling like I'm the one who has to have all the right answers, to turn that around and empower that student, that child, to, right, make their own observations. Often when they come to us and they say, you know, Miss Call, what is the right answer to this? If I give it to them, right, their decision making goes down. It's like, okay, I'm done. Whereas if we turn that around and invoke that curiosity, right, prompt that curiosity, the growth mindset, you could do anything, you could be anything, but what do you think? Then we're empowering that child and that family perhaps to, right, think more openly. I guess that's a quick answer. I'm not sure I fully answered the question, but that's a quick answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duke. We have a few more here, so I'll work through in just the order that they were submitted. Another question is, are you familiar with any introductory surveys for students to help them kind of begin to recognize culture in the classroom?
A survey? No, I'm not familiar with any surveys that would be quick and easy to do. But any of you could create one. In fact, you're in a better position to do this than I am, because you know your students, your environment, the kind of families that have students in your school. So, you know, just think of things that are common among what your kids talk about. Again, depending on the age range, if you're teaching second graders, this might be different than if you're teaching 10th graders, right? What are they aware of? So, this could be the range of social media. Do you prefer TikTok or Pinterest? Do you prefer Snapchat? How many times a day do you prefer to use Snapchat or this or that? Right? Social media. You're going to get lots of answers there. In terms of behavior, how do you make decisions? And you could have, 3 or 4 different varieties of answers, right? I always get my answer off the internet, or I always ask my phone, right? But then, behavior, clothing, dress, I used to work in Wisconsin, and in the middle of the winter, it was common to see high school boys in shorts going to school, right? Waiting for the bus, and it's 20 or 15 degrees outside, right? So, maybe you just ask about clothing. What kind of clothing is appropriate to wear at these different times of year, different weather patterns? So, right, you're going to get all kinds of answers, and then, right, innovate from there and create your own surveys, like what I was showing a few minutes ago with this sort of stand on the left, stand on the right, or somewhere in the middle. You're going to find any number of kind of answers. Someone in the chat just said discussions on school dress codes are very illuminating about school culture. Having my son went to a school where they did SMOD, standard method of dress, and standard method of dress was a huge issue for my son going into 6th grade because he'd never done that before. So, okay, keep going, Alicia.
Thank you so much. Our next one is, how do you approach this when you're teaching a language that covers multiple cultures and subsets of culture? Would you focus on just one culture at a time, or perhaps briefly give an overview of several cultures simultaneously?
Well, I guess I would say that it's probably essential to, shall we say, lose one culture and focus on the varieties. Earlier I mentioned that there's really not any national culture, as much as we like to think of American culture, French culture, Spanish culture, that really isn't a thing. Within each of these societies, there are tens of millions of people and lots of different variations in which, okay, there's going to be certain patterns that are common across many people, but others that are very different. So rather than trying to focus on one certain culture, I would sort of open the range of potential areas of exploration. One thing that could be done is more of a research kind of approach, where you empower the students to make their own observations. One thing that is common is to use a cultural observation journal. And this could be a language activity, right? So you could do this in 1st year or 3rd year, German, French, Spanish, of empowering them to begin to write down things that they observe. Again, the key thing here is, if they're not interacting with people, then they don't have their own observations. But if you've got some movies or some scenarios that you're watching, that you can say, okay, let's be watching for how they express themselves in the language, but also about other things like interaction styles, how close they stand, how far apart they stand, whether they touch, whether they don't touch. There's this famous idea that in France, it is very common for French people to touch each other on a regular basis. So if you have your students go out into a cafe, you would observe, or at least other people have observed, that French people touch each other approximately once a minute, right? So over the course of an hour, they might be touching each other 30 to 60 times. That's touching on the hand, touching on the arm, laughing, whatever that might be. It's all sort of, very superficial. But back to greetings, right? Touching, doing the cheek kisses, all of that's kind of part of that. So if you're watching any TV shows or anything else as part of your language learning, right? Ask the students to be watching for indirect communication styles. If you can see any difference between this person or this group and that person, they might be able to start seeing that in action, even if they're not interacting with people from the target language.
Thank you so much. We have our next question is tied to that in a way. The asker wants to know how you would prepare students to engage with a guest speaker, whether it's either virtual or in person, who's from another culture.
Well, I guess I would say that whatever that interaction could be, should be authentic. Again, this could vary from, if you've got ninth graders or second graders, all the way to 12th graders, how much interaction and language ability they have. I guess one way to prompt this would be to encourage your kids to think of questions. So, okay, everybody think of 2 or 3 questions before, and then we'll have opportunities for some degree of interaction, whether that's Q&A, whether that's playing a game together. I mean, there could be any number of ways in which you can facilitate interaction that is comfortable and authentic. Now that's going to vary if it's someone who does dance, right? A flamenco dancer is going to be very different than someone who comes in and plays the bagpipes, right? So, your guest speaker, your guest performer might vary depending on what they're doing. But yeah, I would say try to make authentic interaction. If you've only got a 50-minute class period and that person is speaking for 40 minutes and there's 10 minutes of Q&A, the level of interaction is going to be very low. So maybe prompt us with 10 minutes of presentation and 40 minutes of Q&A. You can think of what it is that you're trying to accomplish there.
Thank you so much. I think several of us have been taking notes as you're speaking, just with wonderful ideas that you have sparked in ways that we can not only enrich what we're already doing, but perhaps, do a journal as you suggested that I know my students have not done in the past, but it sounds very intriguing. So thank you.
The other one, it's
Yeah.
not just taking notes, it's specifically prompting an intercultural conflict, not provoking. Having them observe a time in their life, right, in your class or in their life, where they have had conflict. And the goal here is to help them to observe within themselves how they were feeling through that experience. I could talk about all of this for another hour, but one of the suggestions is that we help people, and especially students, to recognize the emotion in these intercultural experiences, right? So the joy and the happiness, but also the confusion, the loss, the frustration. Someone came up to me and they asked me what time it was, and I said what I thought was the right answer, and they laughed at me, right? That sort of, that feeling of, no way, I couldn't do it right. Well, that's normal, right? And that's how we learn. That if you look at a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, someone riding a bike, that's normal. So we need to kind of help students to recognize that we're not going to get everything right. We just plow through and we learn through the experiences.
I feel like that would address the power distance scenario that we were discussing earlier as well. That ties perfectly with that. Well, Dr. Duke, I just want to thank you again on behalf of Nebly and the Malika Foundation. We're honored to have you, and you always bring such great energy and, like I said, brilliant ideas. So thank you once again for taking your time this summer.
Happy to do it. Happy to take any questions that anyone would want to send via email as well.
Oh my gosh, we really appreciate that. We will have this posted, so you may have some questions coming after the live session, but it was amazing.
Is it okay to share out your email?
Oh yeah, sduke@nebraska.edu.
I'll get that in there. Thank you so much.
Happy to. Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to see you. I wish you all the best with your classes, interacting with your own students, their parents, families, all of that comes along. So best wishes with all of it.
Thank you. Okay, at this